Namaste everyone. Let us start this session by invoking the divine presence with Sri Aurobindo's Gayatri Mantra.
तत्सवितुर्वरं रूपं ज्योतिः परस्य धीमहि यन्नः सत्येन दीपयेत्
It gives me immense pleasure to welcome you all to this 7th session of the ICPR-sponsored lecture series on Sri Aurobindo's political and cultural philosophy, nationalism and Swaraj. The topic of today's discussion is Sri Aurobindo's vision of Indian culture and its role in India's future. And this lecture series has been organized by Center for Human Sciences, Rishihood University, in association with the Indian Council of Philosophical Research, New Delhi. And for facilitating today's lecture, we have with us none other than Professor Michel Danino ji. He's a visiting faculty at IIT Gandhinagar, and he's a remarkable scholar of Indian civilization and history. And for his great contributions, he has been conferred by Government of India the Padma Shri Award in 2017. So without much further ado, I would request you, sir, to facilitate today's lecture. Welcome, sir.
Namaste to all, and many thanks to Rishihood University and Dr. Sampadananji in particular for inviting me. It's always a great pleasure mixed with honor and also a bit of anxiety to speak of Sri Aurobindo. I usually tell people interested in hearing talks about Sri Aurobindo that you might better use the time in reading him rather than listen to talks. And this applies to my own talk here. But sometimes a little exploration and rambling sampling of his thoughts can be of some use for some, especially for students who may find his body of works a little forbidding. So let me take you through a little journey through Sri Aurobindo's vision of Indian culture, and we will have to start from his younger days in the revolutionary movement, keeping always in mind that his thoughts was constantly evolving. It was never fixed, and many people have a tendency to take some pronouncements when he was in the world of politics as final to his thought and vision. But this is not doing justice to it, as he himself pointed out. But nevertheless, we can collect a few very stimulating thoughts, and I will be sharing my screen. I think you have to allow me to share my screen, please.
Yeah, now you can share your screen.
Yes. So please confirm that this is visible to all. Yes, very well, thank you. And these are some photographs well known. I'm sure you will have seen them many times, which actually describe pictorially his own journey. From a very young age, after coming back to India's shores and working in the Baroda state, and all the way to his last stretch of his life in Pondicherry. So let me take you through this journey very briefly. First of all, as a child in England, this is well known, but we have to keep in mind that India, for him, when he returned to India, was really a rediscovery. His knowledge of India was limited, though perhaps he had touched a few essentials in England through a few writings, but nevertheless, he felt a great need once he returned to India and to when he was residing at Baroda to educate himself, which he did in very chaotic manners, if I may say so, basically self-educating himself, but also absorbing from many people or works that he happened to come across. It was not a structured, academic course on Indian culture which he followed. It was very organic but very profound. Now, his initial involvement in the political movement is well known, and it began, as you can see here, when he was 21 years old, where he wrote this fiery series in the Hindu Prakash, New Lamps for Old, and he actually challenged the Indian National Congress, which he saw as a mendicant. There is some echo. You may have to mute yourselves, please. And instantly, what he insisted upon was strength and inner strength. And he was opposed to this cringing in front of the colonial powers. So this quotation, our actual enemy is not any force exterior to ourselves, but our own crying weaknesses, our own cowardice, our selfishness, our hypocrisy, our purblind sentimentalism. I think if you take it in today's context, you would be able to recognize quite a lot of things that are still with us in India today. And I will be returning to this theme of being ruthlessly critical of India, Indian culture, Indian civilization, whenever the need arose, because he believed that self-criticism is always much healthier than allowing, external forces with dubious motives at times to challenge or diminish or denigrate at times Indian culture and civilization. So he was not, a glorifier, absolutely not. But then he also was very critical of whatever he perceived to be flaws, weaknesses, and limitations. Now, this is the Baroda State College, where, as we know, he taught many topics, ultimately becoming the vice principal of the college, which was an important post in those days, and even the acting principal at some time. And during his days, he was revered by his students, especially for his unconventional ways of teaching. He did not believe, and this is something we should remember in days when we are talking about profound, deep reforms in the educational system, he did not believe in the university system as it was in those days. He thought it would eventually kill the intellectual life of India. And perhaps he was right in that prophecy. He did not believe in teaching from textbooks. He would never consult them. He believed in going to the core of topics without, learning anything by rote, but really developing a deep sympathy for your subject, whatever it was, and deep understanding. So this is why he was so appreciated by the more advanced students. And this is the quotation of these days. It is a fundamental and deplorable error by which we in this country have confused education with the acquisition of knowledge. And this is something, if you read the National Education Policy of 2020, you will recognize a lot of echoes of these thoughts. So there we can actually measure how slow India has been to absorb, this wisdom that Sri Aurobindo and occasionally, of course, other great thinkers have deployed in those days, but without being much heard. Much as we have lost as a nation, we have always preserved our intellectual alertness, quickness, and originality. But even this last gift is threatened by our university system, and if it goes, it will be the beginning of irretrievable degradation and final extinction. So this degradation is something that many current contemporary educationists have lamented upon. Whether it is irretrievable or not, well, time will tell, but there is a long way to go to revivify what Sri Aurobindo calls the Indian brain. And to practice what he preached, he felt obliged to accept the principalship as a first principal, the Bengal National College, which was one of the first Swadeshi organizations of education, and where it is now a part of Jaradhpur University. And there he pioneered, and there were a lot of great teachers with him. He taught himself quite a lot of topics, but he pioneered this kind of independent Indian mind, critical mind, which he believed in, and as an indispensable tool to liberate ourselves both from the shackles of the past, and I will return to this point, and of course, to the obstructions of the present, and to build a future India as he saw it. So we will come back to some of these themes. Of course, his role in the revolutionary movement as the unnamed editor of Bande Mataram is well known. I will not spend time on this. This is not the topic for today, but let me still mention that he was the first to spell out the need for independence. And he did not use the word independence because it would have led to the immediate closure of the daily Bande Mataram, but he said the attainment of absolute national autonomy. It is this alone that will settle down this movement. Absolute national autonomy is independence, there's no doubt about it. And eventually there will be cases of sedition against the Bande Mataram. The same law, sadly, that is still being used occasionally in India today. So there is, of course, a lot of churning about, whether we should preserve such a law, or if it has to be changed, how. But this is another topic again. So here we will stop for a moment to spell out this fourfold strategy that he spelled out in Bande Mataram. Very important to keep in mind, because first of all, there is often a misconception that Mahatma Gandhi was the one to spell out some of these tenets. Not at all. They were part of the movement against the Bengal partition in the first decade of the 20th century, especially from 1905 onward. And one of the pillars was Swaraj, independence, which is a word that the nationalist fraction of the then Indian National Congress convinced Dadabhai Nauroji to explicitly use and foreground in his address to the 1906 Calcutta session, which actually sent the moderates in the Congress into some sort of panic mode, and we will see that the next year they managed to get this objective erased in a way. Swadeshi was the thought of many people in those days. Why should nationalists promote British products and the destruction or restrictions on Indian native industries? So this is a big theme in itself, and it did succeed in reviving some of those industries. You can take the case of Prafulla Chandra Roy, the great chemist, who created a number of such industries in Bengal a few years later, and this was as a result of this policy. Boycott, of course, of British goods, that went together with this policy, and national education. And this is something that he insisted upon. Once again, in India, we have been cut off by a mercenary and soulless education from our ancient roots of culture and tradition. So he emphasized always this need to build upon those roots. As we will see, it doesn't mean that he accepted the past uncritically or as something to be simply revived and repeated. No, we'll see that Sri Aurobindo was not a traditionalist in any sense of the term. And nevertheless, he said we have to build on these ancient roots of culture and tradition, because there at least was a strength that would allow us to develop our abilities, our intellectual faculties in particular, reconnect us with our soul, and then look towards the future and build something new out of it. This is when he gave a farewell speech to this same Bengal National College after the first sedition case against Bande Mataram. He resigned as he did not want the college to suffer from that prosecution. And he was, as you can see here, garlanded by the students and teachers of the college, and then delivered a very soul-stirring speech on what was the mission of that college and how young Indians should achieve great heights and personal success, but always for the sake of the nation. So this is well known, and this should be something that we should use in all our educational tools. So we see him now, once this seditious case against Bande Mataram was thrown out for lack of evidence, because as I said initially, there was no named editor, though everybody knew that it was he. Now in Surat, the Congress, the moderates found a way, as I said, to erase the initial declaration for Swaraj, but then the nationalists among them decided that this was unacceptable, and this led to a big clash. This is the famous Surat split. And excuse me. And we see here Sri Aurobindo presiding over the nationalist faction, with Tilak, the great Bal Gangadhar Tilak, on his left, standing and addressing this faction of nationalists after a fairly violent clash in which the police had to intervene. So this led to the split of the Congress, which would last many years, and which would in effect slow down this open declaration for independence and force a part of the nationalist movement, not the whole of it, into more violent actions to assert this goal of independence. Now, during those days, he wrote a lot. He wrote in Bande Mataram once the newspaper was shut down, and he had to spend a year in jail, as we know, the famous Alipur bomb case. It was in Karmayogin, and we find a lot of stimulating thoughts. There would be so much that I would recommend, if you are interested in that aspect of his life. I would recommend a book at the end of my talk, which has a lot of significant extracts. But I just picked almost randomly some thoughts, because we have a certain political climate in India from independence days, which is trying to change, but not changing fast, and perhaps not deeply enough. And we find that he insisted upon certain principles of forthright discourse, political discourse, forthright, open, critical, of free opinions. And we find that this is something which is usually suppressed in India. This has been almost a practice after independence, that we should always be too polite. We should always sweep things under the carpet when they are a little unpleasant. And we can see even today, certain news items which remind us of this. And this is what he saw as a degradation in the Indian character. This he wrote at some length elsewhere. So therefore, open attack, unsparing criticism, the severest satire, the most wounding irony are all methods perfectly justifiable and indispensable in politics. We have strong things to say. Let us say them strongly. We have stern things to do. Let us do them sternly. But there is always a danger of strength degenerating into violence and sternness into ferocity, and that should be avoided as far as is humanly possible. But I think if you look at the political discourses that we've had in India, we are very, very far from this expectation from Sri Aurobindo. And then a bureaucracy is always inclined to be arrogant, self-sufficient, self-righteous, and unsympathetic, to ignore the abuses with which it abounds. And this is something we should always meditate upon and keep in mind, because there have been millions of victims of the Indian bureaucracy after independence, from the lowest, village level to the highest level at the central government. Bureaucracy has not covered itself in glory, and self-sufficient, as he says, it has looked after itself much more than after the genuine interests and needs of the Indian public. And to close this chapter of his this fight for Indian independence, we see that the estimate of the British authorities were quite straightforward, and this is the best testimonial that we can expect of his important role, which is generally eclipsed from textbooks for the simple reason that the desire of Sri Aurobindo was to actually remain hidden behind the scene and not to be at the forefront. And he, in fact, was obliged to come to the forefront reluctantly at the time of the Bande Mataram sedition case, and more so at the time of the Aleppo bomb case. And therefore, Lord Minto made this famous statement that Sri Aurobindo is Aurobindo Ghosh, as he was known in those days, is the most dangerous man we have to deal with at present. Edward Baker, Lieutenant Governor of Bengal, wrote, "I attribute the spread of seditious doctrines to him personally in a greater degree than to any other single individual in Bengal or possibly in India." And I think this is a fair assessment of his role. Now we continue the journey. Of course, this is his arrest in the Aleppo bomb case, his 1-year stay in the Aleppo jail. And I would like to remind you that tomorrow, 6th of May, 2023, is the anniversary of his release from the Aleppo jail after he was acquitted by the Judge Beechcroft, who had been his batchmate in the ICS examination in England, and could not believe that such a deep scholar who beat him in classical Greek and Latin, among other topics, could have become a revolutionary, exploding bombs to kill people. So this is his journey in brief. The famous Uttarpara speech is there for us to revisit, but I will not go through it at present. I would rather like to take some of his more challenging thoughts, which are usually sidelined or ignored. And this is where I assert, I think without any risk of exaggeration, that Sri Aurobindo was not a traditionalist, even though he spoke often of Indian traditions and traditional foundations. He was actually opposed to tradition wherever or whenever it became ossified and rigid. And therefore, this beautiful thought that the spirit and ideals of India had come to be confined in a mold, which, however beautiful, was too narrow and slender to bear the mighty burden of the future, of our future. When that happens, the mold has to be broken. Now, please reflect upon this. He wants to break the mold of those spirits and ideals, which were rather restricting and confining the spirit and ideals of India. This is extremely important, and we do not reflect upon this sufficiently. And even the ideal lost for a while, he doesn't mind, even if this ideal is lost, because he knows that it will be recovered free of constraint and limitation. The mold is broken, he says in 1909. We must remold in larger outlines and with a richer content. I'm coming back to this again because it is so important to my mind. Now he comes to Pondicherry, and I'm going through certain now again challenging thoughts that from 1910 to 1950, 40 years of life in Pondicherry, we can, and I will be skipping very, very briefly because this could go on this could be a whole course, in fact, and I am sure that Sampadananda Ji is using a lot of such material in his own courses. So this is something that we should reflect upon, not just skim through as to bow down to Sri Aurobindo. Of course, we bow down to him, I do, but we must also look deeply into his mind and thoughts and not be satisfied with simply revering him, worshipping him, and doing nothing with his thoughts is the worst kind of injustice we can do to him. I think he would prefer fierce criticism to this kind of blind worship. This is my take. So therefore, in 1911, when a friend of his, former associate in the revolutionary movement, spoke of doing politics and again pushing the revolutionary movement and so on, he advised him not to. And he said spirituality is India's only politics. It is the fulfillment of Sanatana Dharma, which is its only Swaraj. So therefore, he's now taking these labels that he and others were using all the time during the first decade of the 20th century to a totally different level. And this is what we already felt in the Uttarpara speech, which I had to skip. I have no doubt that we shall have to go through our parliamentary period in order to get rid of the notion of Western democracy by seeing in practice how helpless it is to make nations blessed. India is passing really through the first stages of a sort of national yoga. And what he develops in many other writings and talks to his disciples, no longer speeches, because now he's going progressively into increasing retirement from public view and ultimately from his own disciples. What we see is that when the freedom fighters wanted Indian independence, many of them were trying to say, okay, what kind of independence do we envision? And this was a central concern to Sri Aurobindo, very, very central. And many of them simply looked up to Western democracies, European democracies in particular, because they saw a certain amount of freedom there, undoubtedly. They saw freedom of thought. They saw, of course, independence. And they saw certain mechanisms by which they thought that the public had some say in the running of the said democracy. Democracy means, as you know, rule of the people, democracy. But Sri Aurobindo differed because he considered that these democracies, first of all, were imperfect in their own native countries, but would be far more imperfect in the Indian context, given the state of the Indian population and given the local native organic mechanisms through which the society had learned to organize itself. And therefore, he insisted, writing after writing, on the fact that India had to develop its own political system, its own systems of governance, which could borrow certain elements from Western democracy, but not the whole system. And yet this is exactly what independent India did. So therefore, his national yoga was really a recipe for the regeneration of India, through which the body, the emotional part of aesthetic, artistic part of the nation, the intellectual part, and the spiritual part would all be transformed through this national yoga. So it's of course a whole huge program. Whether it will ever be realized, we do not know, and we'll have to wait and see. Now, let me share a few more thoughts so that we can explore his evolution very, very honestly. First of all, we are often told, and this is quite a fashion today, I notice, that Sri Aurobindo was a champion of Hinduism. Now, it depends how we define Hinduism. It all depends. And here, in fact, he is giving us two different definitions of Hinduism. And one is that it takes its stand on the kitchen and seeks its paradise by cleaning the body. So he's referring to the whole external, series of customs which we confuse with Hinduism. Perhaps, you have to eat this and you should not eat that. You should practice this kind of ritual and not that one, and so on and so forth. And to him, this externality of Hinduism, though it may have had some meaning once upon a time, only in certain contexts, was not essential, was not central. And if people became fixated on such externalities, they would lose the other Hinduism, which seeks God not through the cooking pot or the social convention, but in the soul. The latter is also Hinduism, and it is a good deal older and more enduring than the other. So this is important because there is this tendency to still confuse things and use Sri Aurobindo for certain purposes which I believe he would have disowned. And his commitment to the rules and fundamentals and essence of Indian culture, or let us say the central truths that we see in the Vedas, the Upanishads, and the Gita and other texts, his commitment was definite, but not to the externalities which often, he said, were simply the result of circumstances in the past few centuries. So when people blamed him for not being a traditionalist, he answered, I think it is in one talk with the disciples, he answered that if he has to choose tradition, then he will go back to the Vedic tradition, the original tradition, and not recent traditions, which we think have been there for all time, but are just the product of a few centuries. So therefore, and this I would like to repeat, Sri Aurobindo was not a traditionalist. And this is incidentally reflected in his interpretation of the Rig Veda. This is something which is a whole different topic, but he rejected, let us say, he rejected the traditionalist and especially ritualistic interpretations of the Rig Veda to a very large extent. Now, let us continue. The soul of Hinduism languishes in an unfit body. Break the mold that the soul may live. If the body were young, adaptable, fit, the liberated soul might use it. But it is decrepit, full of ill health and impurity. It must be changed not by the spirit of Western iconoclasm, which destroys the soul with the body, but again, he repeats again, by national yoga. This is the second time we see this phrase under his pen. So he is very clear that Hinduism, as it was in 1910, to some extent, perhaps something has changed now, is not something that he wants to adopt in that form. He wants to go to the essence, the liberated soul, as he says, and not the outer body of this whole so-called religion. We know very well that Hinduism is much more than a religion. It's a body of spiritual, cultural, ethical, social customs and precepts and teachings. But nevertheless, he was not happy with it in that present form. This much is clear. Let us continue now. We see now his concern with India. He's in Pondicherry. These quotes are from 1917, 1920. And now he's worried about, he's convinced that India is going to achieve independence. He knows that by now it is unavoidable. And though he will be critical, I have not developed this topic today because that takes us more to the political side of his teaching. He will be critical of the methods of Mahatma Gandhi, and he will privately disagree with his strategies, his also precepts and dogmatic assertions about nonviolence and so on. But nevertheless, he remains convinced that Indian independence is unavoidable, and it's unavoidable because this is simply the direction that nations are taking worldwide. He could see that this age of colonialism was almost over. It was reaching its end, and therefore it would not endure. And in the process, India would become independent. Now, he says democracy as it is now practiced is not the last or penultimate stage of political organizations, of governance, if you like. For it is often merely democratic in appearance, and even at the best amounts to the rule of the majority and works by the vicious method of party government. Vicious method of party government defects the increasing perception of which enters largely into the present day's dissatisfaction with parliamentary systems. What he's saying here is something we don't reflect upon because we take it for granted that democracy means party democracy, party government. And this, of course, is something that comes from European systems. Even in Europe, the division that party government and the system of party division imposes has been extremely wasteful. The amount of wasted opportunities, wasted energies, wasted finances that the different parties imposes is stupendous. Now, in the case of India, I don't think I need to tell you how defective party governments have been. And, we've seen the kind of corruption and malpractices that all these horse tradings and defections and manipulations for this or that party to grab power, we have seen how detrimental this has been to the growth of India. So therefore, he has something different in view, which would be party-less. And this is something on which there has not been sufficient thought. And I know that a few intellectuals have tried to conceive of a different system, but the question is, even if we do conceive, and it's not very, very difficult to conceive of a system in which the elected representatives would not belong to any party, would be on their own. Today, we would call them independent members of parliament, for example. It's not difficult to conceive of such a system, but how is it ever going to happen is, of course, a moot point. But, unless you first float the right thought, there's no way it will ever crystallize. And even at some point, the very idea of democracy in decades before the French Revolution of 1789, it looked like a total dream, unrealistic dream. But the idea was floated. And it was because this idea grew in strength that eventually the event happened. So we need to have the right ideas and the right concepts without fear of criticizing current systems. It's not about persons. It's not about this particular political figure or that one. It's about the whole system on which we function or often fail to function. His second thought here is what preoccupies me now is the question what India is going to do with its self-determination, how it will use its freedom. You see that he has no doubt about it in 1920, on what lines it is going to determine its future. And this he will continue to discuss in many of his private talks, private letters, more than political pronouncements, which will be very few. I believe that the main cause of India's weakness today in 1920 is not subjection nor poverty, nor a lack of spirituality or dharma, but a diminution of thought power, the spread of ignorance in the motherland of knowledge. Everywhere I see an inability or unwillingness to think, incapacity of thought or thought phobia. So you can see here how for him, the intellect has to play a very, very important part, not only in the individual life, of course, but also in the life of the nation. And we can perhaps witness at some parts of the history of independent India how unoriginal its intellectual life has been. So this to me remains a challenge. There are attempts to revivify in India's intellect, but it's going to take a long time before we see the full fruit, because in the meantime, there are many pitfalls also. There is also a tendency to take shortcuts and have a kind of fake intellectuality that is really just a collection of slogans. You will excuse me for not being specific and not providing actual examples, because that would, of course, take us into controversial fields. And I just want here to outline the broad principles upon which Sri Aurobindo saw the possibility of building a new India. Let's continue. And actually, I do not have much more to share, because we could go on and on listing such thoughts, but I think by now we begin to envision, or let us say we begin to attune ourselves to Sri Aurobindo's vision. And once again, he emphasizes this need to be aware of the past and to build upon it whenever possible, but not to be enslaved to it in any way. Our past, with all its faults and defects, should be sacred to us. So first of all, he acknowledges that there are faults and defects. That's very important. Therefore, he's not a glorifier. He does not believe in a past glorious age of India where everything would be near perfect. And any genuine, honest historian would have to agree with that, of course. But the claims of our future with its immediate possibilities should be still more sacred. So this is a fundamental principle. We do not reject the past. We use it wherever we see that it gives us strength and clarity, and also some fundamental spiritual teachings, but we should not be limited to this. And in the essays on the Gita, he explicates this even further. He says, we of the coming age, the coming day, stand at the head of a new age of development, which must lead to such a new and larger synthesis. We are not called upon to be orthodox Vedantins of any of the three schools, or tantrics, or to adhere to one of the theistic religions of the past, or to entrench ourselves within the four corners of the teaching of the Gita. So you see, even the Gita, which he writes about in this book so eloquently, perhaps more eloquently than anyone has ever done, even the Gita, he doesn't want to be limited by its teaching. That would be to limit ourselves and to attempt to create our spiritual life out of the being, knowledge, and nature of others, of the men of the past, instead of building it out of our own being and potentialities. We do not belong to the past dawns, however beautiful they may have been, but to the noons of the future, right? So this is extremely important. And again, anyone who puts Sri Aurobindo as, in the line of all the great philosophers of the past, from Shankaracharya to let us say Sri Ramakrishna or Swami Vivekananda, and though he may have had great praise for them, and you will find him use some of their thoughts and contributions in his own philosophy, his own message, his own vision, his own work, we cannot limit him to those past teachings. This would be doing him an injustice. So therefore, when the mother said very clearly that Sri Aurobindo does not belong to Indian tradition or any tradition, this was pretty shocking to many, but it was actually faithful to his own thought and evolution. Now we come to the last stage, where a couple of years before the end of his earthly life, he was awarded a prize by Andhra University, and of course was not going to go there in person, but he decided to accept it and to write a speech which was read out by someone, I forget whom, and where he tried to take stock of where does India stand today? Because now India was independent. This is 1948. So it was a very young, very new independent India, and yet it was still the same ancient India at the same time. So how to resolve that paradox? And here again, he gives us these two sides of his thought, his vision, which people often have difficulty reconciling. But Sri Aurobindo was a great reconciler. In his philosophy, we have to see the truth everywhere, and we should not work by rejection. We should not claim to have exclusive truth, because there's no such thing as the exclusive truth according to him. According to him, very, very clearly, the human intellect is not designed to express the truth. It is an instrument, but it cannot grasp the whole truth. It can only grasp partial aspects of it. But at the very least, we should attempt to reconcile and synthesize as many of these different facets of the truth as possible. So this is what he tries to do. It would be a tragic irony of fate if India were to throw away her spiritual heritage at the very moment when in the rest of the world there is more and more a turning towards her for spiritual help and a saving light. This must not and will surely not happen, but it cannot be said that the danger is not there. What exactly is he referring to? He's referring to the fact that now a lot of people, now that India is free, are talking about building India. Of course, this had to be done, and it still has to be done. But building India, how? And when he hears about, we are now in the modern age, and we have to look to science, we have to look to technology, we have to look to big development projects. These are the temples of modern India, and many of you will know what I'm alluding to. There he feels that there is danger, because if this means that the past has to be completely thrown out, this was never his intention. His intention was to use the past as a stepping stone to the future, not to be enslaved by the past, but accepting the strength it gave us, the strength after all for this civilization to survive through all these millennia. And then using that, looking to the future and building something new. So he writes, no doubt we will win through, but we must not disguise from ourselves the fact that after these long years of subjection and its cramping and impairing effects, a great inner as well as outer liberation and change, a vast inner and outer progress is needed if we are to fulfill India's true destiny. So you can see that he insists on preserving the spiritual heritage, the whole positiveness of India's civilizational achievement, and yet not remaining limited by it. And this vast inner and outer progress is something that I think is yet to be accomplished. We cannot say that after 75 years, we have fulfilled Sri Aurobindo's hope for such a vast inner and outer progress. So this is certainly something which I think he would today point to. Finally, thank you to all of you. This is the book which I was referring to at the start. If some of you are more interested in exploring his thoughts about India and his vision for India and how India is to move towards it, I think I would recommend this book, which I had the privilege to edit, and it is 100% his own writings, speeches, talks, articles, messages from his young days, in fact, even before returning to India, and all the way to his passing away in 1950. Thank you very much. If there are any questions, I will be happy to try to answer.
Thank you very much, sir, for this highly informative lecture. And we started by, you started by explaining how Sri Aurobindo's thoughts kept continuously evolving throughout his life, and how he used to say that enemy is not external, but it is our own weakness and hypocrisy which is the real enemy. You also said that Sri Aurobindo was not a traditionalist in the sense that we call traditionalist now, but he was ruthlessly critical of Indian culture, and he believed that self-criticism is a healthy practice, and it saves us from being criticized by someone else who has some dubious motives against us. And these are few points that I found very, very important to note. So I would request our participants, if they have any questions, they can ask Professor Danino.
Can I just start? Can I ask?
Yeah, please go ahead.
Yeah. So thank you. This was a wonderful, wonderful lecture. What I would be interested in understanding is how do you see do you see Auroville's role in understanding Sri Aurobindo's vision for Indian culture and India's role in the future for the world? So how would you see, where would you please place Auroville in this? Are there any thoughts on that?
So Auroville, as you know, was envisioned by the mother in the 1960s and inaugurated finally in 1968, in a way as a sort of laboratory to implement Sri Aurobindo's vision of national, international world unity, where all nations, representatives of all nations of the world would come and live together. And today there are some 60 nationalities represented in Auroville, the first of which is India, in fact. And then there would be this ideal of human unity embodied in Auroville. Now, this looks like a nice ideal, but I would like to remind you that neither Sri Aurobindo nor mother were hollow idealists, intellectual idealists who would simply be happy with some of these noble ideals, but would without working out their implementation. And what they both knew and wrote about and taught about at length is that such an ideal cannot be realized unless there is a radical change deep down in human nature. Because the all mental ego will always be an obstacle. And we see how this whole human intellectual is actually too noble a term here, this mental ego, and coupled with vital desires of greed and desire for power, are tearing the world apart. So these obstacles, mother knew very well that they would manifest themselves in Auroville just as well. And therefore, it would be, a long development towards its fulfillment. Nevertheless, I have to say that in nearly 55 years, actually precisely 55 years of its existence, Auroville has accomplished a lot. And this can be seen even to the outside eye. You can see a regenerated environment. And as the late Narasimha Rao used to say, he in his state of Andhra Pradesh, he would see village after village going towards desertification, impoverishment, whereas Auroville had a totally opposite trajectory. It was high praise actually from him. we see a lot of very valuable experiments in all kinds of fields, from alternative energy, construction, architecture, lifestyle, and so on, alternative education also, all the way to experiments in governance, maybe the weakest point in Auroville's achievements. We can see how these have inspired a lot of examples elsewhere. There have been tens of thousands of volunteers, trainees coming to Auroville from India, from many parts of the world, and learning, in some units, some handicrafts, some service group. And Auroville is actually being consulted all the time by the Tamil Nadu government, by several wings of the central government, and by different NGOs worldwide for those, alternative systems, which are certainly the future for the world, because all systems, as Sri Aurobindo had predicted, are failing, are crumbling, falling apart the world over. So therefore, Auroville now stands as the kind of crossroads, because Auroville is now under a certain government administration since actually 1981, when there was an ordinance followed by a certain Auroville Foundation Act in 1988. And yet, if you read Mother's messages, she never wanted any government to manage Auroville. She explicitly wrote that no government, no organization such as UNESCO, somebody was proposing UNESCO once upon a time, should run Auroville. It cannot be run by any of these agencies. And yet we do have a government body in place. Now, initially, the thought was that the government would only be a protector and a facilitator and would not be an actual manager. But now it has veered towards the government being more and more of a manager in every detail of Auroville's life, which was not the original intention. So we have a certain problematic situation today, about which I would not like to go very much further into the current developments, because they are fast evolving, number one. Number two, I happen to be a member of the International Advisory Council. So whatever views I have, I root through that body and through the internal consultation mechanisms that we have, in particular with the governing board of the Auroville Foundation. So therefore, I will limit myself to saying in conclusion that Auroville has great potentiality, has certainly achieved great accomplishments, but of course is still an imperfect experiment, which many Aurovillians will readily admit. Again, this self-criticism is something that you can witness there. But ultimately, the problem that Auroville poses or is confronted with is nothing else but this radical change in human nature that Sri Aurobindo and Mother wanted, because without which it cannot succeed. And therefore, there has to be a certain critical mass of people who have risen to a higher level where the human ego can be put aside, at least, if not transformed initially, so that a true collective body can emerge on the principles that Mother wanted.
Thank you, sir. Nikhil Rao ji is asking that what model of governance was Sri Aurobindo advocating for, if not Western parliamentary democracy?
So he, I think, did not ever spell out a full system, because you see, Sri Aurobindo believed in organicity very much. He thought that any system has to be the result, the outcome of an organic evolution. If you define a system in advance, you are already limiting things. You are already creating a mold that will not be adaptable to circumstances. So what he gave was certain broad lines. For example, he was certainly against party-based democracy. There's no doubt about that. You can see many writings to that effect. And therefore, imagine for a moment how India could be today if there had never been any parties after independence. Only just this 1 point reform, that we will have a democracy created by independent members. Of course, we can still imagine a lot of horse trading, groupism, a lot of manipulations of I'm going to buy 10 members here, 10 members. But Nevertheless, it would have been a completely different spirit altogether, and we would never have heard of, the defection law or anti-defection law, which is very imperfect. We would not have heard of parties hoarding resources on a colossal scale to develop their vote banks and so on and so forth. So this was one point. But the one thing which he insisted upon, and this is extremely clear, and I've put many of these extracts in this book. If you want, you can explore. The one thing that he insisted upon was building from bottom up and having a certain broad hierarchy at the top with some kind of a president and yes, representatives, elected representatives, but who would build upon the local strengths of, because what he pointed to, and it's historically absolutely correct, is that Indian society has always been ultimately self-organizing. It has always created its own structures. The panchayat system, not what we have today, which is not the original panchayat system. The guilds, which are self-organizations of sometimes traders, craftsmen, traders, farmers, and so on, and so on. So Indian society has always thrown up a lot of bodies that it itself created organically. And these bodies used to be respected by the rulers. For example, we have inscriptions which declare that the ruler will not interfere with the bylaws that a particular guild of traders will create, as long as the guild of traders respects the laws of the land, and the traders pay tribute in the activities, pay taxes, in fact, to the ruler. Why should the ruler interfere? If the guild is going to make the trade prosper, and then the ruler has only to gain, because he will get more taxes. So more revenue out of this trade activity. So that was the spirit, and Aurobindo insisted that we have to let the society organize itself. There's a beautiful quotation from him where he insists upon, I don't know if I can find it very, very quickly. I will maybe read it out to you, because for him, it was going to be something fundamental to, yes, I got it. And this is 1938 in a talk to disciples. In fact, I should have put it in these slides. I will add it for myself, where he says in an evening talk to his own disciples, 1938, he says, I have no faith in government controls. Now, this itself is one fundamental principle of a new system of governance, that government controls should be as few as possible. The government should control as little as possible. It should trust the society. And unfortunately, the socialist system that we had after independence was based rather on mistrust than on trust. So this is one fundamental principle of his vision for a new government. I have no faith in government controls because I believe in a certain amount of freedom. Freedom to find out things for oneself in one's own way. Even freedom to commit blunders. Nature leads us through various errors and mistakes. When nature created the human being with all his possibilities for good and ill, she knew very well what she was about. Freedom for experiment in human life is a great thing. Without the freedom to take risks and commit mistakes, there can be no progress. And then he continues about the European systems and how you should organize by all means, but there should be scope for freedom and plasticity. And he explains how in the totalitarian states, and he even includes a certain amount of European politics into that, it is the efficient, well, this is the birth of fascism, as we know, fascism in the historical sense of the term, fascism in Italy and in Germany. And he says, it's the efficiency of the state as an organized machine, not that of the individual. The individual has no freedom, he doesn't grow. So therefore, if you want to extract a principle of ideal governance according to Aurobindo, it is a system in which the individual has to have freedom to grow. and the structures created from bottom up organically by the society itself. So this is a brief answer. I could go on and on because this is a very important and complex topic, but I think I've given you a few hints. I can see a question in the chat box. Shall I take it?
Yeah, sure, sir.
So it would be interesting, Akhil Singh is asking, to hear from you about the implementation of Sri Aurobindo's thought on education in accordance to the National Education Policy of 2020 or in Indian education system currently in general. I'll give a brief answer because that's another huge topic and I could go on this. You will see that the National Education Policy is actually quoting Sri Aurobindo in a few places. And what is being developed at the moment is a national curriculum framework based on that policy. The policy is a car without wheels. The national curriculum framework being now worked out, and the Ministry of Education has put on its website what we have called a pre-draft. It's not even a proper draft as yet. These are the wheels which will allow the car to run, hopefully. Now, there you will find quite a lot of thoughts of Sri Aurobindo, especially when it comes about the topic of India rootedness, because the national education policy is very clear that the ideal Indian student after school should have rootedness in Indian culture and tradition. But again, we don't mean this to be in any rigid sense of adherence to the externalities of these traditions. So therefore, the whole philosophy of education that is being formulated, both in the national education policy and in this curriculum framework, still under elaboration, it will take a few months before a final draft is released, is very much in tune with Sri Aurobindo's philosophy of education, which is, first of all, I would like to remind you, he said the first principle of education is that nothing can be taught. I'm sure you've all heard this very paradoxical but very stimulating thought of his. Nothing can be taught. What does he mean? He means that you have to awaken the inner mind and spirit of the student, and you have to give the student the abilities to learn by and for himself or herself. You have to teach the student how to learn. You are not actually teaching stuff. You're not teaching materials. Of course you will. As a matter of illustration and exposing the student to whatever materials, good materials can be used, yes, but that is not actually the central purpose of education. So therefore, this whole idea is of mugging up material to eventually take an exam, pass an exam, is completely thrown out, at least in principle, by the new education policy. And hopefully, in the curriculum framework under elaboration, we will be seeing a lot of these thoughts of Sri Aurobindo and other great thinkers of his time. You can read Tagore, you can read Swami Vivekananda on education, and many more. And they were all hostile to this mechanized view of education that the British system had implanted. But whereas I see a lot of people continuing to blame Macaulay and the British system, we forget that we've had 75 years to change that system, and we have not. It's only now that we're beginning to seriously tackle it. And how soon this new vision of education will become a reality, I don't know. There are so many steps in between, including working out detailed syllabi and rewriting textbooks and so on and so forth. There are still many steps to go through. So I think we first, in that spirit of self-criticism, we should first blame ourselves, India of the past 75 years, for not having seriously thought of what is education about, what should it really achieve, what are its real objectives, and how do we go about that? It has been a very, very downward spiral, in fact, making the system worse and worse and putting more and more pressure on the students to the point that students have become extremely frustrated at the end of 12 years. They cannot think for themselves. They are actually insecure. They have no self-confidence, and you know, those who are praised for achieving rank 1 and 2 are just recording machines. They are not thinkers. And how many, you know, powerful independent thinkers have we produced in 75 years that can stand on the world stage? Not many. So therefore, it's as if we are still at the beginning.
Thank you, sir. We will take one final question, but before that, I would request all the participants to kindly fill the attendance form that has been sent in the chat box. Also, kindly switch on your videos so that we can take a snapshot of all the participants present. So, moving forward, sir, we would take one final question that is Bittal Sarangi ji is asking that is Protestantism having any influence in modern spiritual Hindu nationalists of Bharat, especially with regard to the question on self-criticism and moving away from tradition?
I did not quite catch this Protestantism. What exactly is meant? Can you rephrase the question, maybe?
I think he means the moving away from the authority, like the
Okay.
Protestants in England moved away from the church. So like those traditional gurus,
Yeah.
maybe.
So what I call non-traditionalism, maybe. Can you then repeat the question if you don't mind? I'm sorry.
Yeah, sure, sir. He asks, is Protestantism having any influence in the modern spiritual Hindu nationalists of Bharat, especially with regard to the question on self-criticism and moving away from tradition?
I don't know, because, you know, India is such a big country with so many layers. What do I really perceive of the present movements, except a few headlines in the newspapers? I don't watch TV, by the way. Of course, I can read here and there on the internet, but I don't follow social media. You can see that I'm a very backward person in many respects. But I'm not sure. You see, there are movements on the surface, and this whole so-called Hindutva movement, for me, remains really at the surface of things. When you contact actual people in different spheres of life in India, you get very, very different perceptions, okay? And you get a sense of much more maturity, much more self-reflection. You meet people who actually do, because those who talk a lot or sometimes shout a lot are usually people who don't do. So you have the doers, you have the talkers. This is common to all movements across the world. And therefore, I'm not sure I can answer the question, because what concerns me much more is really how much people are imbibing of, you know, revolutionary thoughts, revolution in the true sense of the term, not at all in the political sense of the 1910s and so on. The revolutionary thoughts that someone like Sri Aurobindo has expressed, because he was really a revolutionary. He was really a rebel in the true sense of the term, in the positive sense of the term. And my answer to this is that I actually come across a lot of people who have been impacted and continue to be impacted by his thoughts, and not superficially. People who really read. I'm surprised. I'm very often surprised, you know, and by students coming to me and said, I've read this, I've heard that. I find it difficult to grasp at times, but there is a deep and growing interest in and turning towards Sri Aurobindo. And again, not in this hollow sense of worshipping. You know, I'm a devotee. I visit the Samadhi. I bow to his image. I burn incense, perhaps in front of his photo. And actually, there's nothing. Not that I'm saying there's anything wrong with all that. It can be absolutely part of one's own inner attitude. But then, if you miss out on the thought and its power of regenerative power, then again, you're not doing justice to him. So I don't know that the present discourse of Hindutva is just too noisy for me. I have delicate ears, so I don't go by slogan shouting. But I think there are many, many degrees in understanding Sri Aurobindo and really applying his vision to the instrumentation of what we need to change India. I think there are too many degrees. I would not want to give any general statement that would be unfair towards all those who are trying genuinely. So this is perhaps a disappointing answer, but that's all I can do.
Thank you very much, sir, and for taking all our questions and answering them. And I would now like to thank our sponsors, Indian Council of Philosophical Research, for sponsoring this lecture series. Professor Sampadanand Mishraji, who is the Director, Center for Human Sciences, for conceptualizing this entire series, and all our participants for joining us today. And we would like to close this session by observing a minute of silence. Thank you everyone for joining us today, and we will see each other real soon for the 8th lecture of this series. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Danino.
Thank you. Namaste. Thank you.